Old school versus new school. Baseball analysis. Ken Honor Zone here, Vista, California. March 9th, 2023. I'm covering offensive categories, beginning with batting average, most hits, runs scored, runs batted in, home runs, triples, doubles, singles, slugging, on base, total bases, base on balls, stolen bases. Offensive categories. I divided baseball history into two 75-year periods, 1870s through 1949. Old school. Then 1950 through 2022, new school. Which group of players had better stats accomplishments? I wrote a book, I analyzed the stats, came out with the results. Batting average, old school wins. Most hits in a season, old school wins. Runs scored, old school wins. Runs batted in, new school wins. Home runs, new school baseball players win. Triples, old school. Doubles, old school. Singles, old school. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 categories. The score is 6-2 old school. This video, slugging. Who are better sluggers, old schoolers or new schoolers? Well, if you go to the chapter, what you do is you go to a decade and you take the average for the decade. Who won slugging in their individual year and average it out for the 10-year period? 1870s, the average slugging, 448. 1880s, the average slugging, 540. Who had the high in the 1870s? Cap Hansen. 1880s, Dan Brothers. 1890s, average slugging, 575. The highest for the decade, Sam Thompson, 696 slugging. 1900s, average 542 slugging. The high for the decade, Nap Lajoie, 643. 1910s, the average 557. And who had the high? Surprisingly, Ty Cobb, 620. My mistake. No, 1919. 1910 through 1919. Cobb had a 620 in 1911, which was the high, but then in 1919, which closed out the decade, Babe Ruth beat him 657. But the average for the decade, 557. 1920s, this remarkable decade for slugging, 759 average. And the high, Babe Ruth, 847. 1930s, the average 699, and who won the decade? Jimmy Fox, 749. 1940s, 642 average slugging. And who won it? Ted Williams, 735. So the aggregate slugging for the period of 1870s through the 1949, the average, 595. How'd new schoolers do? 1950s, the average 640. The high for that decade, the 50s, Ted Williams, 731. 1960s, the average 620. Who had the high for the decade? Mickey Mantle, 687. 1970s, 607 average. Who had the high? Jim Rice, 693. 1980s, average slugging, 576. Who had the high? Mike Schmidt, 644. 1990s, the average slugging, 580. And who had the high? Jeff Bagwell, 750. 2000s, average slugging 609, and the high, Jim Thome, 677. And then the 2010s, the average was 564, and the high was David Ortiz, 620. I'm covering Hall of Fame baseball players only. So the aggregate slugging for new schoolers, baseball players, from 1950 to 2022, 599. What did I say, old school? 595. So new school beat old school in slugging. So the score after 9 categories, old school 6, new school 3. How many categories we got left? Well, we have on base, total bases, base on balls, and stolen bases. Can the new schoolers catch up? It's 6-3 is the score. 4 more categories left. Does new school win or does old school win? Recap the slugging. 1870s, 448. 1880s, 540. 1890s, 575. 1900s, 542. 1910s, 557. 1920s, the highest out of all of them, 759. 1930s, 699, and the 1940s, 642. 1950s, 640. 1960s, 620. 1970s, 607. 1980s, 576. 1990s, 580. 2000, 609. And 2010, 564. So the high for the old schoolers was in the 1920s. It was 759 slugging average for the 10-year period. And for the new schoolers, the high was in the 1950s. It was 640. So new school wins and slugging. How about on base? We'll get into that next video. Then I'll do total bases, base on balls, and stolen bases. I'm trying to find out who is better, old school or new school baseball players. I wrote a book, I analyzed it, and I'm curious to find out who wins. Thanks for watching.